9 years ago, the average Dublin home cost around €267,000. By early 2024, asking prices in many parts of the city were well into the €300,000 €400,000 range. And by 2025, they've pushed even higher, putting ownership out of reach for many. Rents have more than doubled in the past decade, while wages have stayed largely flat. Each year, the rate of population growth runs several times faster than new home completions, tightening the squeeze. Entire generations now see home ownership as a distant prospect. How did the story of economic success turn into one of exclusion? From Celtic tiger to housing trap. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, Ireland was promoted as an example of how quickly a small nation could transform its economy. The period now called the Celtic tiger delivered some of the fastest GDP growth rates in Europe. Overseas investment poured in, wages climbed, and buying a home was a realistic goal for most working households. Affordable living and the promise of stability were part of the draw. Yet today, that same growth story has produced a very different reality, one where the distribution of its benefits has tilted sharply and is now at the heart of Ireland's housing crisis. At the time, a skilled trade or an early role in the growing tech sector could pay enough to buy a home within commuting distance of major cities. Mortgage lending rules were relatively straightforward, and many single-income households could manage a mortgage, bills, and still save. Now, while Ireland ranks among the highest in GDP per capita in the EU, incomes for ordinary workers have not kept pace. Real wages have largely lagged behind housing costs in recent years, even as prices have climbed by double-digit percentages annually. Economic growth has concentrated in sectors and asset markets that push living costs higher rather than making life more affordable. The mismatch between national wealth and individual affordability is stark. Ireland's economic output per person ranks at the top of European tables, yet the median full-time wage remains far below the level needed to comfortably afford a home in the capital. This disconnect shows how strongly the rewards of growth have skewed toward owners of capital and property. Housing in particular is now treated primarily as an investment vehicle rather than a basic necessity, keeping many who would have been first-time buyers in earlier decades permanently in the rental market. 2 decades ago, political and economic leaders spoke about building a modern Ireland that could compete internationally while delivering broad domestic benefits. Motorways, upgraded public transport links, and a wave of foreign direct investment seemed to signal progress across the board. But the boom years relied on deregulation and heavy inflows of international capital. After the 2008 crash, construction output collapsed and never returned to a level that matched the surge in jobs and immigration during the recovery. Supply stayed far behind demand, especially as global investment funds began buying Irish housing stock in bulk during the past decade, driving prices further beyond local wage growth. By Q1 2024, the nationwide average asking price was about €326,000, and new mortgage rates for first-time buyers hovered around 4.2%. Combined, these factors significantly narrowed what households could afford compared to the low-rate era just a few years earlier. In Dublin and surrounding areas, prices are far higher again. A typical one-bedroom apartment in the city now costs over €2,000 per month to rent, and mortgage approval for an average-priced home often requires an income well above what most workers earn. For many, neither renting nor buying is financially sustainable without multiple high salaries and substantial savings, something increasingly out of reach as energy, transport, and food costs rise. What makes this more striking is that these conditions exist during a period of strong headline economic growth. The Celtic tiger proved Ireland could reframe its global economic position quickly, but the years since have shown that, without policy to counterbalance the effects, rapid growth can deepen structural problems. Housing affordability has eroded steadily for over a decade, creating an environment in which even those on salaries well above average are often committing close to half their income to keeping a roof overhead. The perception during the Tiger years was that economic success was tied to opportunity for ordinary citizens. The shift away from that reality began subtly, resale and rental prices climbing in the post-crash years, limited construction activity, and renewed investor demand. Wages trailed far behind, and over time, a chronic affordability gap formed. For younger generations, that gap has been most visible in housing. A 2023 survey found that 7 in 10 people aged 18 to 24 said they wanted to leave Ireland for better prospects elsewhere. A clear signal that the sense of being locked out is not just economic but cultural. Even looking beyond Dublin, the challenges persist. Commuter towns within easy reach of the city have seen housing costs nearly double in 10 years. Improved transport connections have, in some cases, accelerated price increases by making these areas more attractive to those shut out of the urban market. In rural regions, lower home prices are often offset by limited local employment and the necessity of long-distance commuting or remote work, which is not viable for everyone. The result is a growing set of personal stories that echo the same basic reality. People are working full-time, sometimes in more than one job, yet cannot realistically save to buy a home. Parents see their grown children priced out of the towns they grew up in. Renters face annual hikes that push them to the brink, while rising property values steadily widen the gap in wealth and security between owners and non-owners. For advocates of Ireland's open, high-growth model, these outcomes present a difficult truth. Strong GDP headlines do not guarantee better living standards for the majority. Wealth indicators alone say little about whether an economy is serving its citizens effectively. In 2024 and 2025, the same global investment flows and high-value sectors that power Ireland's statistics also intensify its housing pressures. High salaries in certain industries fuel demand and competition, overseas capital turns homes into financial assets, and years of insufficient building magnify the shortfall. The forces once credited with Ireland's transformation are now central to its housing problems. Foreign direct investment, a strong global reputation, and standout GDP per capita remain features of the economy. But for much of the population, especially the young, they no longer translate into the chance to settle, buy a home, and plan a future here. Instead, these trends have lifted costs, shortened options, and made leaving the country a practical consideration for stability as much as a lifestyle choice. This is what defines the modern housing trap, an economy that excels in producing growth, but one that has priced many of its citizens out of the very communities where that growth is concentrated. And while the structural roots run deep, the pressures are most visible in the realities of day-to-day housing costs, the numbers that no one living here can afford to ignore. The numbers no one can ignore. Across Ireland, the pattern is clear. The gap between what people earn and what they must pay for a place to live has stretched to its widest point in decades. The numbers tell the story more starkly than any headline. In 2015, monthly rent for a one-bedroom apartment in Dublin averaged just under €1,000. By early 2024, that figure had climbed to around €2,100, with certain neighborhoods commanding even higher amounts. Wages have risen in the same period, but at nothing close to that rate, leaving more and more households spending a disproportionate share of their income on rent. Home purchase figures are equally telling. In the mid-2010s, a household earning around €50,000 a year could, in many cases, qualify for a mortgage on a modest property in the capital. Today, mortgage qualification thresholds in Dublin frequently require incomes far above the national median, often well into the high tens of thousands or beyond, before a bank will lend. Central bank measures set a maximum loan-to-income cap of 4 times income for first-time buyers and 3.5 times for others. Combined with loan-to-value rules requiring a personal deposit of at least 10% for owner-occupiers and 30% for buy-to-let purchases, the barrier to entry has never been higher. Even in cases where monthly repayments might be manageable, saving the required deposit, often €50,000 or more, proves an obstacle most cannot clear. This is not solely a Dublin problem. Cities like Cork, Galway, and Limerick have all seen rents for standard 2-bedroom apartments approach double their 2015 levels. Prices are lower than the capital, but still far beyond what local earnings can comfortably cover. Lending limits apply nationwide, and while intended to prevent reckless borrowing, they also shut out large sections of the market who simply cannot match the required income to loan ratios. For middle-income households, the transformation in just a decade has been severe. In 2015, a couple earning €60,000 between them would have been considered stable, able to rent comfortably while saving for a deposit. In 2024, that same household's income is often consumed entirely by rent, utilities, and transport before they can set aside anything towards a down payment. Factor in sharply rising costs for childcare, insurance, and energy, and even well-paid professionals often find themselves unable to make meaningful progress toward ownership. Would you expect a mid-career professional on €60,000 to afford a 2-bed in Dublin today? The answer, in most cases, is no. Set the wage and housing cost figures side by side and the contrast is immediate. House prices and rents have risen far faster than wages since the mid-2010s. Graph it, and one line rises slowly while the other climbs steeply. This breaks the old assumption that steady work naturally leads to home ownership over time. For many younger than 40, that assumption no longer holds. Affordability indices from recent years confirm the shift. While exact figures vary between datasets, they consistently show conditions at or near historic lows, with Dublin markedly less affordable than a decade ago. Even those on combined household incomes above average often find they fall short of the threshold needed to purchase in the capital. Unsurprisingly, the number of first-time buyers has flattened, and the typical age of purchase has drifted into the late 30s. Owning property is no longer a guarantee of mobility within the market. Homeowners aiming to upgrade often face such a large jump in prices that moving becomes as daunting as entering for the first time. For renters, limited stock and upward-only lease reviews mean that shifting to a new property frequently brings a sharp rise in monthly payments. Many choose to remain in unsuitable or overcrowded homes simply to avoid the financial shock of moving. The shortfall in social housing delivery deepens the imbalance. Stock has risen far more slowly than population, and annual additions are often offset by older units leaving the system through tenant purchase or redevelopment. In several counties, waiting lists run to many years, sometimes stretching beyond a decade for larger family units. With limited availability, many in need are placed in temporary accommodation and reliant on housing benefit that covers far less than market rents. This increased pressure feeds straight back into the private rental sector, intensifying competition and sustaining high prices. Living comfortably in Dublin, covering rent or a mortgage, bills, transport, food, and a modest savings plan now demands an income that is far above what most earn. For a single person, that means somewhere close to €85,000 a year, for a couple about €120,000. Meanwhile, the average full-time wage remains below €50,000 in 2025. For households on €40,000 or €50,000, the arithmetic simply doesn't work without merging incomes across multiple adults, or surrendering more than half of earnings to housing costs. For younger people just starting out, the climb is steeper still. Paying €800 a month for a single room in a shared house, common in cities like Dublin and Cork, drains savings capacity to near zero. Rising bills for heating, groceries, and commuting tighten the squeeze, making the tens of thousands needed for a deposit feel further away each year. For some, the only realistic way to own property or plan a family without decades of financial strain is to leave the country altogether. Even for those who clear the deposit hurdle and secure a mortgage, repayment stress is a growing reality. With average new mortgage rates for first-time buyers around 4.2% in early 2024, many borrowers find their housing costs taking up 40–50% of gross income, well above the 30% threshold generally advised by banks. This leaves minimal capacity for emergencies, investments, or future planning. The market functions for those with high salaries, dual stable incomes, or inherited wealth, but remains effectively closed to much of the rest of the population. The divide between owners and non-owners continues to widen. Those who bought before the sharp upswing benefit from equity growth and far lower repayment burdens. Those still renting, by contrast, see their largest monthly expense yield no long-term asset. Over time, this structural divide shapes not only where people live, but whether they can realistically imagine a secure future in Ireland's urban centers. These statistics are not abstract. They show up every day in the choices people are forced to make. And for those unable to shoulder the costs of the private market, the last available safety net is under strain unlike anything seen in recent decades. What happens when even that net fails is becoming more visible in daily life. A homelessness crisis in full view. On the streets of Ireland's cities, the evidence is there for anyone to see. A parent carrying bags of groceries and belongings into a budget hotel. Children hunched over their homework in a cafe because their room has no desk or quiet corner. Families living out of suitcases, unsure where they will be sleeping next week. These are no longer rare scenes. Homelessness has moved from the margins into the center of public life. Official homelessness figures have risen sharply and are now in the thousands nationwide. Over the past decade, both the numbers and the use of emergency placements have grown substantially. Dublin's homelessness figures have increased dramatically in that time, with more families among those affected. The drivers are familiar: rents that outpace wage growth, evictions linked to landlords selling properties, and the slow delivery of permanent social housing. Emergency accommodation has become a standing feature of the system, not a short-term stopgap. Hotels, hostels, and converted offices are housing people for months, even years. In some cases, a family of four shares one hotel room, cooking on a single electric plate and keeping their clothes packed because there's no storage. Privacy is fleeting, and the constant prospect of being moved adds pressure to already strained lives. The impact on children is stark. Inconsistent school attendance, long commutes from temporary placements, and the disorientation of never having a secure home. Overcrowding inside these facilities has become common. Rooms intended for 2 people sometimes squeeze in 4 beds. Shared bathrooms serve dozens, and communal kitchens are put under relentless pressure, leaving residents with tight time slots to prepare their meals. Health professionals report a steady rise in stress-related illness, poor sleep, and anxiety among those staying in emergency accommodation. For some children, this transient existence is all they have known. Social housing waiting lists reveal the scale of the shortfall. In some urban areas, people can wait more than 10 years for an allocation. Many applicants cycle repeatedly between temporary placements, short-lived private rentals with state support, and fresh eviction notices. The instability complicates schooling, healthcare, and community support as every move disrupts existing networks. Among those forced into emergency systems are people in steady employment. While their incomes would once have covered a modest rental, today demand far outstrips supply. Even with rental support, securing a property in high-demand areas is difficult, as landlords often favor applicants whose income comes entirely from wages. For families overlooked in the private market, the local authority is the only fallback. Accounts from inside the system echo similar themes. One single parent describes 7 years on a housing list, with every advance towards the top undone by policy changes or reviews. Another family, evicted when their landlord sold up, has been moving between hotels for over a year, finding out each week if they will have to relocate again. Such uncertainty is now ingrained in the lives of many. Local authorities and the state respond by contracting rooms from private hotels and guest houses. While it provides a roof, this is a costly short-term fix compared with building permanent homes. In some areas, large portions of hotel rooms are already allocated to other emergency needs, such as housing asylum seekers and refugees, making availability even tighter. The competition for these spaces underlines the strain across the entire temporary housing network. Charitable organizations report a growing number of people seeking help who have never needed homelessness services before. Young professionals priced out of rentals, older people unable to manage increased costs on fixed pensions, and families displaced by landlord sales all now appear alongside those previously living in more precarious circumstances. It is a sign of how far the crisis has extended beyond the profiles traditionally associated with homelessness. The geography of the problem is broadening too. Pop-up food distribution points and mobile health units are now a fixture in multiple cities. Galway, Limerick, Cork, and many smaller towns experience the same upward pressure on emergency housing, even if on a smaller scale than Dublin. In rural counties where local capacity is often minimal, placements can mean relocating entire families far from their jobs, schools, and networks, adding social isolation to financial stress. When compared internationally, Ireland's rate of homelessness is now among the highest in Western Europe relative to population size. Part of what makes the crisis so visible is that it cuts across boundaries of age, occupation, and background. Commuters traveling to work from emergency accommodation. School children heading back to hotel rooms instead of family homes. Pensioners sleeping on chairs in crowded reception areas because all beds are taken. The current situation is not the result of a sudden shock, but the cumulative effect of years where housing supply failed to match demand. The emergency system bears the weight of that shortfall daily. Stories of doubling rates over a decade, record numbers of children without stable homes, and emergency centers stretched past capacity are no longer restrained to reports and policy debates. They are visible on busy streets, in public offices, and in the routines of thousands who never thought they would face life without a secure place to live. As the housing gap persists, the pressures on emergency beds are being amplified by other factors shaping Ireland's population and housing needs. That added strain is becoming harder to separate from the wider shortage of homes, and it is now playing out not just in the capital, but in towns and cities across the country. Immigration and the supply squeeze. Ireland's openness to immigration has been central to its modern recovery. Following the financial crash, the arrival of workers and students from abroad brought skills, investment, and cultural diversity that reshaped the economy and daily life. Workplaces became more international, communities adapted, and the population expanded steadily. This was seen as a marker of progress and confidence. But today the pace of arrivals is colliding head-on with a housing system that was already under severe pressure. The debate isn't about whether migration has value, the economic benefits are undeniable. It's about how the country can support it when infrastructure has failed to keep pace. The figures underline the challenge. In the 12 months to April 2024, around 150,000 people arrived, the highest level in 17 years and the third consecutive year with more than 100,000 arrivals. Over the same period, housing completions fell short of the government's target of over 33,000 units for the year. Even if every new home went to new arrivals, which it doesn't, supply would still lag far behind population growth. The simple reality is that, for every home built, several more people are joining the market. This pressure is not limited to the cities. Some rural towns and villages have seen sudden dramatic population increases that overwhelm local capacity. In one case from 2024, a village of just 165 residents was proposed as accommodation for 280 asylum seekers, an almost overnight doubling of the population. While such moves come with long-term integration plans, the short-term strain on housing, schools, and transport can be immediate. Public services in these areas often operate with only enough capacity for the existing population. A primary school near its limit may have to create temporary classrooms. Local GPs already booked out see waitlists lengthen. In many rural areas, public transport is limited to a handful of buses a day, inadequate for new residents without cars. Emergency funding can be provided, but it cannot match the speed of population change, forcing reliance on temporary measures that paper over deeper shortages. The impact extends directly into the housing market. In regional towns with small private rental sectors, a single property listing might attract dozens of applications from both locals and newcomers. Long-term residents can find themselves priced out, while new arrivals often face equally tight competition. This is not a matter of one group displacing another. Both are competing for an undersupplied resource. Without faster expansion of housing stock, the pressure inevitably fuels higher rents and shrinking choice. Migration has always brought benefits beyond economics, and successful integration is not just about finding somewhere to live. New residents need schools for their children, access to healthcare, and pathways into the workforce. Volunteer groups across the country provide language classes, job search support, and community orientation, but even these informal networks have limits. When the pace of arrivals exceeds capacity, social integration can slow, leaving newcomers isolated and communities unserved. The mismatch between demand and supply has persisted for years. In the early 2020s, net immigration added more than 100,000 people a year for 3 years running, yet housing output never reached the level required to keep up. The result is cumulative. Each year's shortfall is carried forward into the next, widening the gap and making it harder for the market to stabilize. Government responses have included converting existing buildings, such as former hotels, convents, and office blocks, for temporary use. While these provide shelter in the short term, they are often located far from employment hubs and well-serviced transport routes. For asylum seekers still awaiting status decisions, restrictions on accessing the labor market mean skills can be underused, slowing both individual progress and community benefit. In the cities, the competition for housing layers on top of existing demand from Irish-born renters and buyers. The same two-bedroom flat might be sought after by a graduate moving to Dublin for work, an international student starting a course, and a newly arrived family. Landlords frequently choose tenants who can pay more upfront or who tick certain employment boxes, intensifying the squeeze on anyone without significant financial reserves. In smaller towns, increases in demand have pushed house prices sharply higher. Homes that sold for €150,000 only a few years ago can now exceed that figure by a wide margin, driven in part by purchases linked to relocation programs or state-funded accommodation schemes. While this can breathe economic life into struggling areas, it can also shut out local first-time buyers who now face much higher entry costs. If housing output continues to trail population growth, the competition will affect everyone. The link between high migration and rising housing costs is not caused by the arrivals themselves, but by the failure to expand the system to absorb them. Policymakers face a choice: either scale housing and services to match the growth, or accept that living costs will keep climbing and availability will keep falling. The economic case for migration remains strong. The boom years relied on immigrant labor, and the same is true today. Hospitals, tech firms, construction sites, and hospitality businesses all depend on skills from abroad. But in housing terms, the country is running too far behind to absorb the numbers without displacement or strain. The outcome is predictable: rents rise, vacancies fall, and competition hardens. Every person who moves to Ireland needs somewhere to live, and communities can only expand so fast. The difference between a smooth integration and a visible strain often comes down to timing. When arrivals consistently outnumber new homes, the shortfall compounds year after year, putting additional pressure on both the private and public housing sectors. This growing imbalance is shaping everyday experiences across the country, from bidding wars for rental properties to packed classrooms and overstretched GP clinics. And it's altering how people view their own prospects in Ireland. For some, the conversation is no longer about waiting for the situation to improve, but about whether to build their lives elsewhere. Young and leavings. Among younger adults, the conversation is increasingly about whether staying in Ireland makes sense at all. A 2023 survey found that 7 in 10 people aged 18 to 24 wanted to leave the country for better opportunities elsewhere. For many, that question has shifted from a passing thought to concrete planning, choosing a destination, calculating costs, and setting a departure date. The motivation is not the old pull of adventure or a year abroad experience, but a calculation about stability, whether they can realistically secure a home and a decent standard of living here. In the early 2000s, prospects looked very different. A graduate entering the workforce could expect a modest but workable rent and still set aside savings. Home ownership in your 20s was challenging but achievable. The legacy of the mass immigration of the 1980s and early 1990s felt firmly in the past. Popular narratives celebrated returning migrants, first home purchases, and the idea that starting your adult life in Ireland was not only possible but normal. Political and social expectations centered on retaining young talent rather than watching it leave. 2 decades on, those assumptions have unraveled. A recent graduate from Galway offered €38,000 to work in Dublin might find that rent for a single room in a shared flat is €900 or more each month before bills. That means more than half of take-home pay going to rent alone, with little left for saving or emergencies. For many, comparable jobs abroad come with similar or higher wages but far lower accommodation costs, making relocation an obvious choice. Australia, Canada, and parts of mainland Europe, where the same work leaves breathing room in a monthly budget, remain top destinations. Some examples illustrate the pattern. In one composite case based on accounts shared with us, a nurse left Limerick for Vancouver. Her salary was broadly the same, but the difference in housing was stark. In Ireland, most of her income went to a cramped apartment and long commutes after shift work. In Canada, she could rent a 1-bedroom apartment, cover living expenses, and save for a deposit. Stability came not from higher pay, but from manageable housing costs and better conditions. These situations are not limited to any one sector. Finance and tech workers in Dublin report that rent, commuting, and essentials leave them with less spending capacity than as students. Skilled trades, early career teachers, hospitality staff, and healthcare workers all feature in the outflow. The deciding factor is often whether owning a home in Ireland within the next decade feels realistic. For many, it does not. Ireland has one of the highest GDP per capita measures in Europe, yet many young workers find housing costs outstrip wages. That disconnect is driving departures. There are immediate economic consequences. Skill shortages are emerging or deepening in certain fields. Hospitals work harder to retain younger staff, specialist firms advertise roles for months, and apprenticeship places in trades remain unfilled. The state often bears the cost of training these workers, only to see the benefit realized abroad as those with newly acquired skills move to countries that offer a more attainable standard of living. Longer-term, sustained outward migration in this age group changes the population profile. A fall in the number of people in their 20s and 30s can mean fewer births in years ahead and reduced household formation, which in turn slows activity in parts of the economy. In small towns, losing even a handful of young adults can mean fewer volunteers, lower participation in sports clubs, and declining custom for local businesses. The effect is gradual but visible. Cultural ties are also strained. While technology allows people to keep in touch, absence leaves a mark: empty places at gatherings, missing teammates in local clubs, fewer familiar faces in neighborhood spaces. Cities often offset the headcount loss with inward migration, but this does not replace the specific role of those raised and educated here in maintaining certain community links. In rural areas, the loss is more keenly felt. For some young people, going abroad is framed as a temporary move, a way to save enough to return and buy a home. But as prices rise faster than wages, the target for a deposit shifts further away each year. The longer they remain overseas, the harder it becomes to give up the security, property ownership, or career progress they find elsewhere. Return rates tend to drop significantly after just a few years. The decision to leave is usually the result of layered pressures. A graduate burdened with debt sees rent swallow half their pay. A couple saving for a deposit watches the goal move out of reach. Skilled workers field offers from abroad that promise shorter commutes, lower rents, and a realistic path to ownership without relying on multiple incomes or family inheritance. The housing market turns from a background concern into a deciding factor for where to base a life. For older generations, the pattern recalls earlier immigration cycles, but with a key difference. In the past, departures were often driven by a lack of jobs at home. Now, roles exist and sometimes in abundance, but living near the workplace and covering costs without constant strain is often impossible. This inversion, employment without affordable housing, is fueling a new kind of talent drain. Over time, it can create a feedback loop. As more in this age group see their peers securing homes abroad, the perception grows that Ireland is a place to leave rather than settle. The experience of friends who found affordable rent and stability elsewhere removes hesitation for others still deciding. This network effect accelerates the outflow. If that outflow is concentrated in hard-to-replace areas, nursing, engineering, teaching, the impact on services and industry is immediate. Replacing lost workers requires starting the training cycle again, which takes years. In the meantime, shortages can push wages in certain sectors higher. adding to costs for employers and potentially feeding back into wider living expenses. At a personal level, the calculation made by those in their 20s and 30s is simple. Where can I afford the life I want? Increasingly, the answer lies outside Ireland. If you were offered a comparable job abroad with cheaper rent tomorrow, would you take it? The responses to that question speak volumes, and they set the stage for the wider discussion about why today's housing and cost of living conditions persist despite years of official promises to fix them. Government promises versus reality. By late 2023, the government had set out what it framed as a decisive housing plan for the next 2 years. The headline goal was to deliver around 33,000 new homes annually, with a significant share designated as social and affordable housing. Additional commitments included repairing and refurbishing vacant properties, reactivating thousands of unused council-owned homes, and scaling up rapid build methods to speed delivery. Ministers presented these measures as a turning point, signaling that 2024 and 2025 would finally see supply growth start to meet demand. Yet by the middle of 2025, the gap remains. Central Statistics Office data showed that housing completions in Dublin fell by 25.3% year-on-year in Q1 2024, contributing to a national slowdown at exactly the point targets were meant to ramp up. Returns from local authorities and housing bodies indicate that overall completions are likely to come in several thousand units short of the annual benchmark. Affordable housing has been hit hardest, with schemes aimed at helping middle-income buyers struggling to deliver the planned volumes. In high-cost areas, these projects have been slowed by planning backlogs, rising materials prices, difficulty sourcing skilled labor, and securing suitable service sites. Several high-profile initiatives have encountered the same pattern: ambitious timelines undermined by familiar constraints. The Affordable Purchase Scheme was intended to boost supply of subsidized homes each year, but has been limited by approval delays, inflation in construction costs, and resourcing issues in the building sector. Efforts to reactivate vacant stock through programs like Croí have succeeded in bringing some units back into use, but the totals remain small relative to the scale of vacancy. Many owners still find refurbishment economically unviable even when grants are available, due to high renovation costs and regulatory requirements. Rapid build housing, promoted as a way to produce homes in months rather than years, has expanded more slowly than promised. Deliveries have been constrained by difficulties sourcing components, preparing sites with proper services, and navigating statutory planning rules. Several developments earmarked for immediate rollout remain in pre-construction stages. Where modular units have been completed, they've been occupied almost immediately, underlining just how small a dent they make in current demand. Urban regeneration projects, meant to combine private, social, and affordable units, have also slid off schedule. Some have paused while financing terms or contracts are renegotiated. Others face persistent disputes between developers and councils over design, tenure mix, or public space requirements. Planning appeals in relation to height limits, density, or site usage have further slowed schemes in city districts already under intense housing pressure. Cost rental housing, offering long leases with rents set roughly 1/3 below market levels, has been one of the few newer models to gain traction with renters. However, its reach remains modest. Tenant allocations are measured in the hundreds and application lists open and close within hours. While popular with those who secure a place, the scale to date has not been enough to shift wider market conditions. Social housing construction output is also behind schedule. Local authorities report difficulties bringing as many new build units online as planned due to budgetary pressures and limits on internal capacity to manage multiple projects. Leasing private sector properties continues to be a stopgap measure in some areas, but it does not increase permanent public housing stock and ties public spending to the continuing high costs of the private rental market. The government points to steady increases in total annual completions since the pandemic, but those gains are marginal in the context of sustained population growth. Natural increase in migration combined continue to add more households each year than the number of new homes built, meaning even improved construction performance has not reduced the overall shortage. Significant funding has been allocated, with multi-billion euro budgets announced for acquisition, construction, and retrofitting. Yet the route from budget line to occupied home remains lengthy, and each stage, from site assembly through planning approval to tendering and actual building, brings the risk of delay. Rising energy and materials costs, alongside competition for workers in a busy construction sector, have affected delivery timelines and budgets across the board. Delays to individual large projects have fueled public skepticism. In Dublin, for example, a much-publicized development slated to deliver nearly 1,000 homes by the end of 2024 will now not be finished until late 2026. Similar revisions are appearing in regional cities, where original completion forecasts have proven over-optimistic once works began. When large schemes slip, They can disrupt other planned starts, as resources remain tied up and contractors reshuffle commitments. Vacancy activation remains another area where expectations have outpaced results. While official vacancy rates have declined slowly, many reactivated homes are in low-demand areas that do little to ease urban shortages. In city centers, where utilizing empty buildings could relieve some pressure more quickly, issues around ownership, conservation obligations, and access to capital have slowed progress. Some prime properties identified for conversion years ago remain boarded up. The obstacles are consistent across programs: protracted planning processes, the rising cost of building inputs, shortages of key trades, and procurement or financing challenges. Each of these adds friction to delivery, and in combination they make sustained large-scale building difficult. Even programs that perform as planned are often too small to measurably change market dynamics. These constraints are felt as much in smaller towns as in Dublin and Cork. In areas with few new developments in the pipeline, a delay or downsizing of just one project, perhaps 40 or 50 units, can leave local housing lists static for years. Young adults remain in the family home, renters stay in overcrowded or unsuitable accommodation, and landlords are able to raise rents in the absence of competition. Across all categories, private market, affordable purchase, cost rental, and social housing, the core numbers tell a similar story. The pace at which the stock of available homes is increasing is still lower than the pace at which new demand is being created. Targets are intended to close that gap over time, but repeated missed delivery goals instead see the shortfall accumulate year after year. The commitments are there on paper, and the funding is often assigned. What remains elusive is the consistent conversion of those commitments into tangible, occupied homes at the speed required. This is not about a lack of ideas or plans. It is about overcoming a set of structural and logistical barriers that have proven stubbornly resistant to short-term fixes. The central problem is not lack of plans or money. It's converting promises into steady, large-scale supply quickly enough. That conversion has repeatedly failed so far, leaving households to navigate the same intense competition and inflated costs that were supposed to ease. The continuing shortage feeds directly into the wider financial pressures people face, pressures that have been compounded by trends in everyday living costs. Wages, inflation, and survival. Rising living costs are now a constant in household decision-making, and in 2025, wages still aren't keeping pace. Headline inflation has eased from the sharp spikes of the early 2020s, averaging around 2.6% in April 2024, but that figure hides the reality for essentials. Food and energy remain noticeably higher than in recent years, keeping everyday expenses elevated even as official rates suggest stability. Rent continues to climb in most cities despite rent caps, and any increase on an already high base pushes people closer to the limit of what they can cover. When measured against pay, the problem becomes clear. While average wages have inched upward, the gains for most workers are quickly absorbed by higher costs for housing, groceries, and utilities. Take housing alone. Someone renting in Dublin who was paying €1,900 a month in 2023 may see that rise to €2,000 or more. That marginal change on paper becomes significant when added to a weekly increase in food shops and a higher heating bill in winter. For homeowners, many who fixed their mortgage at 2–3% a few years ago are now approaching the end of those terms and face refixing at much higher rates, roughly 4.23% for new loans in April 2024, with outstanding loans averaging around 3.7%. For some, this means several €100 extra on repayments every month. Renters have even less margin to work with. After paying for housing, rising grocery and energy bills often consume almost everything left. The buffer that used to cover small emergencies or allow for saving towards a deposit is gone. For many younger tenants, that means reacting week to week, paying whichever bill happens to be due and deferring anything not immediately urgent. The sense of control over one's finances erodes quickly in that sort of cycle, and some disengage from longer-term planning altogether. Middle-income households, often framed as financially secure, are finding themselves in the same position. Many public sector and mid-tier private sector workers report that modest annual increases are effectively canceled out by rent or mortgage rises. A small pay increment that once felt like material progress now offers no real improvement in day-to-day living standards. In real terms, the cost of housing is steadily taking a larger share of take-home pay, leaving less available for everything else. These shifts shape personal decisions in tangible ways. Couples who thought they would start families within a few years are postponing those plans because childcare fees, when added to mortgage or rent, would leave almost nothing left to live on. Single parents often face the harshest arithmetic, with housing eating up more than half of income and transport costs adding further strain. When school fees, uniforms, and extracurricular expenses arrive, something else in the budget must give way. The transition off low fixed-rate mortgages is another growing source of pressure. Many fixed in the late 2010s or early 2020s benefited from rates that made repayments affordable even alongside other rising costs. Now, moving to rates over 4% changes affordability calculations overnight. Those with higher energy and food expenditure already at the limit may need to cut spending on essentials to keep up. For people in steady work, the problem is not about a lack of hours or employment opportunities. It's that wages are failing to close the gap with the cost of essentials. Employment data may show high participation and job security, but that hasn't insulated workers from the erosion of purchasing power. Essentials take priority, and discretionary spending has been pared back across the board. Small businesses, especially in hospitality and retail, have noticed the shift, with fewer customers spending freely and more people limiting themselves to necessities. The feedback loop is clear. The more households cut back, the harder it becomes for sectors reliant on non-essential spending to thrive, which in turn limits wage growth in those sectors. Reduced economic activity at the local level can slow job creation, reinforcing the squeeze for workers who depend on those incomes. This dynamic is visible in both rural towns and major cities, where consumer behavior is shifting in ways that dampen economic confidence. Some coping strategies are familiar: canceling or reducing social activities, putting off appliance upgrades, or using the car less to save on fuel. Others highlight deeper insecurity, relying on overdrafts for unexpected expenses, or moving back in with family to avoid rent altogether. While these steps can temporarily balance a budget, they often come at the cost of independence, stability, and future prospects. Even modest increases in non-housing essentials have an outsized impact when budgets are already stretched. An extra €15 per week on commuting, €10 per shop on groceries, and €20 per month for electricity very quickly add up, eroding any pay rise workers might receive. The effect is cumulative and unavoidable. There is only so far costs can be cut before essentials are compromised. Mental strain is an often overlooked part of this equation. Managing finances under constant pressure requires time and energy, and the uncertainty of not knowing whether the next rent review, mortgage rollover, or utility bill will be affordable adds another layer of stress. For those who experienced the last economic downturn, there's the added fear of slipping backwards despite doing everything that conventional wisdom says should provide stability. All of this has left many feeling they are working harder, earning more on paper, and yet becoming less secure over time. Statistics confirm the trend. Housing costs are consuming larger portions of income, while wage gains are modest and often negated by the basics. Savings rates have declined across varying income levels, and debt servicing is growing as a share of household budgets. The gap between official indicators and lived experience has widened in recent years. A headline measure showing easing inflation offers little reassurance when the particular goods and services a household relies on most remain costly. And unlike large one-off expenses, these are pressures that repeat every month, leaving little opportunity to recover. In practice, the choice for many comes down to either keeping housing secure at the expense of almost everything else, or making compromises in quality of life to hold on to a small financial cushion. Neither approach leaves room for long-term security, and both feed into a sense that the economic ground beneath people's feet is no longer solid. That erosion of stability doesn't happen in isolation. How the housing market itself is structured, who owns homes, how they are bought and sold, and what they are used for has a direct influence on whether wages can stretch to cover basic shelter. The system's priorities have shifted, and the consequences of that shift show up every time someone tries and fails to find a home they can afford. When homes became assets. In recent years, the role of property in Ireland has shifted in ways that reach far beyond simple home ownership. For a growing share of the market, housing is no longer approached primarily as shelter but as a financial product, something to generate rent, store wealth, or produce capital gains. This process, often called the financialization of housing, means that part of the stock that could meet actual residential needs is instead positioned as an income stream or future asset. That limits access before a would-be tenant or buyer even enters the market. Institutional and international buyers have played a large role in shaping this landscape. Large investment funds, private equity groups, and real estate firms have bought entire developments outright, sometimes hundreds of apartments or houses in a single deal. Their operating model is built on high rental yields and the long-term growth of Irish property values, rather than individual occupation. For residents, the effect is immediate. When new homes are sold in bulk, there's no opportunity to bid at all. It's not a case of being outpriced, the units never make it to the open market in the first place. This trend is reinforced by other uses of housing that draw stock away from the residential pool. Short-term letting in high tourism areas is one of the most visible. Homes that could sustain a long-term tenant are instead advertised to visitors by the week or even the night, often bringing in more income during peak seasons than a year-round lease. In some districts, local authorities have identified multiple adjacent properties operating as short-term lets, eroding the local rental supply. Rules requiring planning permission for conversions in certain zones exist, but enforcement varies, and the practice persists in many areas. Policy has attempted to respond. Measures include higher stamp duty rates on buyers purchasing 10 or more residential units in one transaction, local authority first refusal rights on certain new builds, and tighter rent control in designated pressure zones. The central bank's rules on loan-to-value and loan-to-income ratios also place limits on borrowing for individuals, though institutional purchasers using cash or pooled funds bypass these entirely. Early results suggest that while these steps have slowed some bulk purchases, they have not eliminated them. Loopholes and workarounds, such as splitting acquisitions across different corporate entities, allow large deals to proceed in modified form. The preference for investment return over occupancy is not confined to new developments. Older apartment blocks in urban centers are being acquired, renovated to higher specifications, and relet at significantly increased rents. While improvements in quality may be welcome, the consequence is often the displacement of existing tenants and the loss of relatively affordable units. This pattern exerts upward pressure on rents in surrounding areas, amplifying localized affordability problems. Vacancy compounds the issue. Official vacancy rates still show thousands of units unused, representing a notable fraction of potential stock, for reasons ranging from holiday home status to probate delays to deliberate withholding for speculative purposes. In some cases, properties are kept empty to await favorable price movements. In others, owners do not wish to deal with the obligations of tenancy. While such homes are counted as part of the nation's housing stock, they are in practice unavailable to those seeking a place to live. Government schemes such as renovation grants for bringing vacant properties back into use have had limited traction. The high costs and regulatory demands involved in bringing older properties up to modern energy and safety standards often outweigh the available subsidies, especially in urban sites with more complex structural requirements. For institutional owners holding multiple properties, leaving them empty can be a calculated investment choice rather than a temporary lapse. Large portfolio landlords also reshape the rental experience itself. When a single corporate owner controls hundreds of units, rents, tenancy terms, and renewal conditions can be standardized in ways that leave little room for individual negotiation. This consistency can raise minimum market expectations, making comparable independent landlords more likely to follow suit. Rent increases across such portfolios don't just affect the tenants involved. They can reset pricing norms across an entire area. Short-term letting and institutional ownership sometimes merge. Certain companies operate part of their holdings as serviced apartments aimed at corporate or longer-stay visitors. These properties are counted as residential but remain unavailable to the local population, representing another loss to the long-term rental pool. In high-demand districts, the cumulative effect can be hundreds of homes effectively ring-fenced for uses other than local residents. From an investor's perspective, Irish property offers clear attractions: limited land availability in key urban centers, steady population growth, and historically strong capital appreciation. Favorable tax treatment in earlier years bolstered returns. For individuals, the contrast is sharp. A household trying to buy must meet mortgage and deposit limits, withstand tightening credit rules, and often compete with cash buyers. Large funds deploy capital flexibly, move quickly, and base decisions on balancing portfolios, not on matching homes to incomes. Vacant or investor-held properties are most visible at street level. A row of darkened windows in a new block, suburban estates where houses sit empty for seasons at a time, or seafront apartments occupied only a few weeks each year all signal a disconnect between what exists on paper and what is functionally available. In tense markets, each unused home represents a lost opportunity to narrow the gap between need and availability. Housing advocates argue for stronger tools: higher levies on long-term vacant units, tighter controls on short-term letting, and closing legal gaps that allow bulk buying to continue despite official limits. International examples show that such measures, if implemented and enforced, can redirect stock to local use. In Ireland, progress has been gradual, slowed by opposition from ownership and industry groups who warn of chilling inward investment or disrupting supply. The outcome is a pool of homes that appears within the statistics but remains beyond reach. Each year, construction adds units, yet a share is filtered out by being kept vacant, converted to short-term use, or transferred in blocks to corporate landlords. Given the already slow pace of building relative to population growth, this removes a meaningful part of what might otherwise relieve pressure. By 2025, the treatment of housing as a tradable asset is embedded deep into the system. Reversing that trend would demand sustained policy measures that shift incentives toward occupancy over yield, a rebalancing of how homes are valued not just in euros, but in social and economic terms. Without that, the gap between need and availability stays locked in place. The result is straightforward. A segment of the housing that exists in Ireland is effectively inaccessible to those seeking long-term homes because it is held as an investment, used for short-term letting, or left vacant pending a more profitable moment. These factors don't operate in isolation. They interact with underbuilding, rapid population growth, and stagnant wages to create a wider, reinforcing crisis. A crisis that is defined less by any single cause than by the way each of these pressures feeds the others. The perfect storm in 2025. By 2025, Ireland's housing system faces a convergence of pressures that have built over years into what can only be described as a perfect storm. Four major forces dominate the picture. Chronic underbuilding means supply has lagged behind need for more than a decade. Rapid population inflows, through both natural growth and high levels of migration, keep adding demand faster than new homes can appear. Stagnant real wages have left workers earning little more, in practical terms, than they did years ago, while the cost of housing has surged ahead. And the financialization of housing continues to funnel part of the stock into investment uses, from bulk purchases by large funds to short-term lets and deliberate vacancy. Each of these drivers is serious on its own, but it's their interaction that locks the crisis in place. They form a loop that constantly reinforces itself. Limited building means the market starts each year with a shortage. Incoming residents add immediate demand, especially in the cities where jobs, colleges, and services are concentrated. Higher demand against restricted supply forces prices up. Flat wages mean more people are pushed out of buying into the rental sector, which increases competition there. That competition makes the rental market more attractive to investors looking for income, and investment purchases reduce the stock available to individual residents. With fewer homes accessible, prices rise again, and the cycle continues. That loop is why incremental fixes haven't worked. Policy changes aimed at easing one pressure tend to have little lasting impact without tackling the others. For example, tax measures raising stamp duty on buyers purchasing 10 or more units slowed some investor acquisitions. But with total construction still below what's needed, those homes were quickly absorbed into the market without relieving scarcity. The same pattern has played out with restrictions on short-term letting. In targeted districts, a few dozen units might return to residential use, but demand from undersupplied areas fills them instantly. Without changes that increase overall output and address affordability, partial fixes simply shift the strain from one part of the market to another. Scale matters. Analysts estimate roughly an extra 20,000 homes per year would be needed on top of current delivery levels to start making a dent in the shortage, a pace Ireland has only just approached in recent years, and even then without breaching it reliably. To reach that consistently would require sustained planning capacity, significant investment, and a labor force large enough to build at that scale year after year. The timeframes involved are a critical part of the problem. New housing takes years to move from plan to completion. Once land is secured, projects must pass through planning permission, site preparation, full construction, and connection to utilities. Each step is vulnerable to delays, whether from appeals, rising materials costs, or shortages in key trades. In contrast, population growth can change rapidly within a single year, driven by migration spikes, higher birth rates, or inward movements to cities for work and study. This structural lag between fast-moving demand and slow-moving supply ensures that shortages persist even in years when completions rise. The market's basic incentives keep working in favor of those who already hold property. Rising values reward owners and investors alike, strengthening the logic of holding assets rather than selling them. For owner-occupiers, the gain is in equity. For investors, it's in both appreciation and income. For those without property, it means competing against wealth and capital they can't match. Income thresholds for mortgages remain out of reach for many in regular employment. And in renting, landlord income requirements often rule out applicants with average salaries, especially if they're applying a loan. What results is not just a market under strain, but a structural imbalance. This is not the temporary distortion of a single bad year or a short-lived surge in migration. The base shortage has been built over years of missed building targets and planning delays, compounded by wages that don't match housing costs and by policies that haven't prevented stock being diverted into investment holdings. It's a baseline scarcity that the market has adapted to, with prices, practices, and expectations all shaped around the idea that there are simply not enough homes to go around. In this environment, smaller-scale interventions, whether a few hundred social housing units added here, a limited rent freeze there, or an investor rule change affecting a handful of developments, barely touch the surface. They can help in specific cases but leave the overall dynamic intact. Without measures that operate across all four of the major forces, even well-intentioned initiatives risk being absorbed by the system without changing its direction. The wider effects go beyond the housing market. Employers in sectors from healthcare to hospitality find vacancies harder to fill when staff can't afford local accommodation. Public services struggle to recruit teachers, nurses, and guardi into high-cost areas. Young people delay moving out or starting families because they can't secure stable housing. When these individual decisions accumulate, they shape national patterns, slowing household formation, altering community stability, and affecting long-term economic growth. From a policy perspective, the entrenchment of these factors makes piecemeal solutions less effective the longer they go on. Because the forces feed into each other, movement in one area without parallel changes in the rest will often just tighten pressure elsewhere. Even wage increases, if not matched by higher supply, risk fueling further price rises. Even rapid new building, if not protected from being diverted into investment channels, can fail to improve access for the households most in need. The design and coordination of measures matters as much as their ambition. The sheer persistence of the current conditions points to why smaller changes over the past decade have not altered the overall picture. High-profile completions add units but get swallowed by demand. Efforts to shift investor behavior curb some practices but leave others untouched. Rules that create affordability on paper can't overcome a shortage of units in practice. By 2025, scarcity is no longer a temporary phase the market will grow out of. It's the underlying state, and tackling it means finding ways to expand supply, align it with incomes, and ensure it reaches those who need it all at the same time. Without that kind of coordinated approach, the same forces will keep running, drawing the housing system back to where it is now. The question is whether Ireland can change course fast enough to stop that loop from tightening further. So can policy break the loop? We'll look at what could actually work. Is change even possible? Fixing Ireland's housing crisis is not beyond reach, but the scale of what's required makes the task far from simple. Current proposals cluster into a few key approaches, each offering potential, but all constrained by the same reality. Even the fastest options still take years before results can be seen. One of the most discussed ideas is rapid build housing. These prefabricated units are manufactured off-site and assembled more quickly than traditional builds, which in theory could bring hundreds of homes into use faster. The advantage is speed once a project starts, but they still require prepared, serviced land and full connection to utilities. Without that groundwork in place, the process slows sharply. They can bypass some bottlenecks, but not the entire planning, approval, and infrastructure sequence. Zoning reform is another frequently raised measure. Current restrictions on building heights or densities in many areas limit how much housing can be created in locations that are already well served by jobs and transport. Changing those rules could allow for taller apartment buildings or denser housing near urban centers without sprawling into rural land. Advocates point to the efficiency of building more homes where demand is highest, but successful reform needs parallel investment in infrastructure, public transport, school capacity, and local services to prevent congestion and loss of quality of life. Land use changes could also have a significant impact. Large areas of underused public land, including state-owned sites and local authority plots, could be prioritized for housing. Redeveloping obsolete facilities or converting unused spaces into mixed-use housing developments would bypass part of the private land market's delays. But activating these projects demands coordination between agencies and political agreement on priorities, as well as securing funding. Without those, such land can remain idle for years. International examples show that structural change is possible when backed by long-term policy and investment. Vienna has maintained a substantial stock of affordable housing through decades of sustained public building and management. Singapore has used centralized land control to ensure most residents own their homes, though its conditions are unique. Helsinki and Copenhagen have increased density strategically around transport links, combining planning flexibility with transport and service upgrades so communities could absorb more residents without a drop in living standards. None of these changes happened quickly. Even in the most successful cases, visible market effects took many years. For Ireland, applying lessons from abroad would mean adopting measures that are realistic for its scale and governance, but also accepting the same requirement for consistency over time. Any major policy shift, whether in zoning reform or land release, would still take 3 to 5 years before completed homes were ready for occupation. Even rapid build solutions need months of site preparation, planning, and service connection. Implemented in 2025, the wider effects would be felt closer to the end of the decade. This time gap is one of the biggest obstacles in practice. Political cycles run on shorter timescales than construction cycles. Elected governments face pressure for visible results within a few years, which often leads to favoring measures that can deliver small numbers quickly over the deeper changes that take longer to bear fruit. Bringing about major housing reform would require cross-party commitment to maintain policy direction beyond a single term, regardless of changes in leadership. Another barrier is the divided responsibility between national and local government. Funding and national policy are set centrally, but planning permission, zoning, and much of the delivery rest with local authorities. Without close coordination, timelines can stretch unnecessarily, and promising projects can stall at the planning stage. Aligning these layers of governance would demand clear structures for decision-making and accountability. To be effective, any supply-side push must also account for market forces that can quickly absorb new stock. The same pressures that created the crisis, rapid population growth, investor purchases, and stagnant wages, will still operate while homes are being built. Without measures to direct new supply toward those priced out under current conditions, much of it risks being taken up by the same groups already able to pay now, keeping prices beyond reach for the rest. This is why some housing advocates stress acting on multiple fronts at once: increasing output, restraining speculative purchasing, ensuring affordability, and upgrading infrastructure together. On their own, none of the proposed measures can shift the overall balance quickly enough. Combined, and with sustained application, they could start to close the gap. Public opinion has shifted in ways that could support such a coordinated strategy. Housing is now among the highest political priorities for voters across income groups, fueled by direct experience of scarcity, rising costs, and growing homelessness. This pressure can move policy agendas forward, but it can also push leaders toward quick wins, smaller projects that demonstrate action but leave the structural shortage intact. Comparisons to other cities underline a key point: importing policies without adapting them to local realities will not work. Vienna's scale of public housing and decades-long investment would require a major shift in Ireland's budget priorities. Helsinki and Copenhagen's success with density relied on robust public transport and well-funded urban services. Trying to match density without those supports risks public backlash. The models can offer guidance but not ready-made solutions. Underlying all of this is the question of whether there is willingness, not just in one government but across successive ones, to make decisions whose benefits might not be fully visible for several years. That includes resisting the temptation to dilute reforms under political or commercial pressure over time, and keeping housing affordability as the guiding measure of success. If current trends continue, annual completions hovering around present levels and population growth near recent rates, the gap between demand and supply will continue to widen. In that scenario, the pressures of 2025 would not ease with time. They would intensify, pushing more households into marginal or insecure situations. Change is possible and the tools exist, but the transition will not be quick. It will rely on scale, on aligning national and local action, and on pursuing several measures simultaneously rather than in isolation. Without that breadth of effort, any gains will be temporary, and new supply will be consumed by the same market forces that define the crisis now. The years ahead will be decisive in setting the direction. The decisions taken and the speed at which they are followed through will determine whether Ireland starts to close the gap or cements the patterns that have driven it here. Ireland now faces a clear choice: take decisive action to build more homes and reform the system, or continue losing young people to places where a stable life is within reach. Delay only pushes prices higher, deepens shortages, and makes recovery more expensive. Waiting won't fix it. Targeted, large-scale building and coordinated policy reform are required. If change is working, you'll see sustained higher completions toward the 33,000 plus annual target, easing rent pressure in city markets, and shorter social housing waits, all measurable in CSO or DAFT updates. Will Ireland choose to make homes a public priority? Are you staying or thinking of leaving? Tell us one reason why in the comments.